Alright class, in this video we're going to work through the Chapter 4 Foundational 15. So this isn't the most ideal, but I have the template to my left and then the connect problem on my right. So that way we can look at both at the same time. Okay, so with Chapter 4 we're looking at process costing. So this is when we have homogeneous products being produced and they go through different processing departments. It can be just one or it can be more than one. Okay, so process costing is a chosen costing method where we're working with homogeneous items that we're making, as opposed to job order costing where we are working one job at a time and each job has its own specifications. Okay, so here we have Clopec Company. They manufacture one product that goes through one processing department called mixing. All raw materials are introduced at the start of work in the mixing department. The company uses the weighted average method of process costing. Its work in process T account for the mixing department for June follows. All forthcoming questions pertain to June. Okay, so it gives us a beginning balance, all the costs that got added to work in process, and then we don't know what was transferred out, okay, which we'll get to. It says the June 1st work in process inventory consisted of 5,000 units with 16,000 in materials cost and 12,000 in conversion cost. The June 1st work in process inventory was 100% complete with respect to materials and 50% complete with respect to conversion. During June, 37,500 units were started into production. The June 30th work in process inventory consisted of 8,000 units that were 100% complete with respect to materials and 40% complete with respect to conversion. Okay, so keep in mind that conversion cost is just a combination of direct labor and overhead. Okay, so the first thing they want us to do based on this T account and the information is prepare the journal entries to record the raw materials used in production and the direct labor cost incurred. So the first one is record the raw materials used. So based on this T account here, we can see that the direct materials that we used is $120,000, right? That's how much got added to work in process from raw materials. So how do we do that? We've done that before, right? The entries will be the same, except you will have to do this entry more than once depending on how many work in process accounts you have for each processing department. So here there's just one, so we're going to debit work in process for mixing, and we're going to debit it for the 120, and we're going to credit raw materials. Okay, and again, where am I getting this from? We can see here that costs were added to this work in process account for the mixing department in the amount of $120,000. Okay, so let's do the next one. Record the direct labor cost incurred. We can see the direct labor cost that got added to work in process is $79,500. All right, so we'll just show that in our journal entry. We'll debit work in process, $79,500, and we will credit salary / wages payable. Let's check our work. There we go. It's all good to go. Now, please note that these entries, the cost flow entries, are exactly the same between job order costing and process costing. Okay, there's no difference. The only thing is you might have more than one work in process account depending on how many processing departments you have. Okay. Now we have to score every time we want to go on, so it's going to check it, and then we'll go on. Number 2, prepare the journal entry to record the overhead cost applied to production. So remember we said the 3 categories of costs that get added to work in process is direct materials, which we just dealt with, direct labor, which we just dealt with, and manufacturing overhead applied, which is that $97,000. So let's do that whole entry. How do we apply overhead? Well, whenever we apply overhead, it's a debit to the relevant work in process account, and then a credit to manufacturing overhead. Because remember, anytime you credit manufacturing overhead throughout a period, it refers to applied overhead. Okay? There we go. We can move on to the next one. So now we'll have to start using our template. Now, do you have to use the template? You don't, but I highly recommend you do because everything's there. If you know how to fill out the template, you can answer any question regarding process costing. Okay, so We are going to focus on the weighted average method in this class. However, there is the FIFO method as well, but we'll focus on the weighted average method, and that's what the template is designed after. So they ask us how many units were completed and transferred to finished goods during the period. How many units were completed and transferred to finished goods? Okay, so we know what our beginning inventory is, which is the 5,000 units, and we know how many units we started work on, and we know how many units we were left with. So let's plug that into our template here. So the step 1 row, that's your physical units. That's different from equivalent units. Okay, so your physical units, we started with 5,000 of them. And then we add in the units that we started work on, which is the 37,500 units. The units we started with plus the units we started on during the month. Let me reword that. The beginning units plus the additional units we started work on will be the total units we need to account for. Okay, so we take this calculator here, take 5,000 plus 37,500. The total units to account for is 42,500. Okay, now we want to know how many units were transferred on to the next department. So do we know what our ending is? Yes, they told us that the June 30th work in process inventory consisted of 8,000 units. So I can plug in right here, there's a work in process ending box. We can show that we have had 8,000 units in ending work in process. Okay, so let me just get rid of that. Your total units to account for minus the units transferred on equal your ending work in process in units. Okay, so if we know the ending and how much to account for, we should know how many we finished and how many we transferred on to the next department. And since this is the only department, this transfer to the next department is another way of saying transfer to finished goods. Okay. So now let's do 42,500. The total units to account for minus the units we had left at the end of June means that, okay, we must have finished 34,500 units. Okay, the total units to account for can be calculated by taking your beginning inventory in units plus the units you started work on. That's the total units to account for. But the total units to account for is also the units you finished plus the units you transferred on and finished plus the units in ending work in process. Okay, so we'll take the 34,500 plus 8,000. That also gives us 42,500. So these two numbers need to agree with one another, right? They need to equal. All right, so now we can answer number 3. We know how many units we completed and transferred out to, in this case, finished goods. So that would be 34,500. There we go. Now let's move on to number 4. All right, so number 4 is asking us to compute the equivalent units of production for materials. Okay, so the equivalent units of production for materials, we're going to want to get to this box right here. Okay, so one little tip though, before we jump right in, is once you figure out the physical units transferred on to the next department, this box right here, you can immediately copy it over to these two boxes on the right-hand side. Because on step 2, we're working with equivalent units. Now, how do we find equivalent units again? Equivalent units is simply the number of partially complete units, physical units, not equivalent units, the number of partially complete units times their percentage completion. So when we think of these physical units that were transferred on, if they're transferred onto that next department, what percentage complete must they be to this department? 100% complete, right? So what is 34,500 times 100% complete? 34,500. So that's why we copy these over as is. However, how many units do we have left over? 8,000 in working process, right? There's 8,000 units that aren't done yet. They're partially complete. Now, these 8,000 units, once you know what the ending physical inventory is, the physical units and ending work in process, you can copy that number over to these two boxes on the left. Now, we're going to see what percentage complete are those 8,000 units with respect to materials. So if we take a look here, it says that the June 30 work in process inventory consisted of 8,000 units that were 100% complete with respect to materials and 40% complete with respect to conversion. So basically what this means is those units that aren't quite finished yet, we've put in all the materials costs into them that we need to put into them. But with regards to direct labor and overhead, we haven't put enough of that cost into them to convert them to a finished state, okay? So with respect to materials, it's 100% complete. So 100% times 8,000, that's 8,000, right? And then we can go ahead and do the same for conversion since we're there. With respect to conversion costs, it's only those 8,000 units are only 40% complete. We still need to add in 60% of the cost. So equivalent unit wise, that's 3,200 units. Okay. So in other words, with the conversion cost that's already been poured into those 8,000 units to get them partially complete, we could have taken that to fully complete 3,200 of those in ending work in process. Now, to find the total equivalent units for materials, you just add the 34,500 equivalent units that were transferred out, plus the 8,000 equivalent units in ending work in process. That gives us 42,500. Okay, but with conversion, we take the 34,500 units that were transferred on, but plus the 3,200 equivalent units that are in ending work in process. That gives us 37,700. Now, what's this question asking us? What is the equivalent units of production for materials? So we're looking for this box right here. So that would be 42,500. Give that a second to load. There we go. Okay, we'll go on to number 5. Okay, number 5, compute the equivalent units of production for conversion. Well, we just found that, right? That would be the 37,700. There we go. Very good. So we've done the physical unit side and the equivalent unit side, and we will need all of this to complete the rest of this table here. Next question, what is the cost of beginning work in process inventory plus the cost added during the period just for materials? So we're talking about costs. Up at the top, we were talking in terms of units, but now in this middle section, in this middle section here, we're talking in dollars. We can see those dollar signs, right? So now they're asking us, what's the total cost of beginning work in process inventory plus the cost that was added if we're just talking about direct materials? Okay, so to answer that question, let's just go ahead and try and fill out this middle section because the next question will also need this middle section. So we can see here that the first row asks us for the work in process beginning, the costs in beginning work in process, but they give that to us, right? We know that the total beginning work in process, the June 1st balance, that's 28,000, right? So we can put that in there. But what does that break down to between direct materials and conversion cost? Well, it says that the June 1st work in process inventory consisted of 5,000 units with 16,000 in materials cost. So we'll put that in here. And 12,000 in conversion cost. 16,000 plus 12,000 comes out to 28,000. Okay. But now let's take a look at the costs that were added in. There we look at the T account for that information, right? We see that there were materials costs added and direct labor costs added and overhead costs added. So remember, direct labor and overhead taken together is conversion cost. So how much materials cost was added? 120,000. So we'll add this as the 120 that got added. See, that second line is costs added. Now, how much conversion cost was added? Well, we added $79,500 of direct labor cost and 97,000 of applied overhead. So let's add those two together to see what the total conversion cost is that was added in to work in process. We add those two together, we get 176,500. So if we take those two together, we can figure out what the total cost was overall that was added to that work in process account, right? We'll take the 120,000 of materials cost that was added, and then we'll take that conversion cost and add that together. So that comes out to $296,500 that was added to work in process. Basically how much we debited the account during the month of June, okay? But 6 is just asking us what is the cost of beginning work in process plus cost added during the period for materials itself, okay? So for that one, we're going to take that beginning amount in beginning work in process of 16,000 for materials and add in the materials cost we added, which was 120. So the total of beginning materials cost in work in process plus the materials cost we added, the total of that's 136. So let's add that one in there. Give it a second to load. There we go. Number 7 asks us the same question, but for conversion costs. What is the cost of beginning work in process inventory plus the cost added during the period just for conversion? Well, we know that 12,000 of the 28,000 in beginning work in process was conversion cost, then plus the 176,500 of conversion cost that was debited to the account, right? That 79.5 and the 97 taken together as conversion cost. So the total of beginning conversion cost and work in process inventory plus the conversion cost we added in, that totals 188,500. Let's score that. There we go. Now to finish off that row, this left-hand side is just a total of everything. So we can take the beginning work in process overall plus all the costs added in during the period to see the total cost that we need to account for. So we'll take the 28,000 plus the 296,500, and then we get 324,500. Now, when we add from the top to the bottom, it should give us that 324,500. We can also find that number by adding the total materials cost to account for right here and the total conversion cost to account for. So if you take that 136 plus the 188,500, it also gives us 324,500. So you can add up these two right here or the total direct materials and total conversion cost to account for. Okay? Now the question is, what is the cost per equivalent unit for materials? All right, so we know the total materials cost to account for, how much is that? That's the $136,000. So we just want to know, what does this come out to on a per equivalent unit basis? Well, what was our total equivalent units for materials? Well, that was this 42,500, right? So we'll take that 136 and divide it by 42,500. And that gives us $3.20. Okay? So basically what that's saying is for every equivalent unit of production, it's costing about $3.20 in terms of materials. Okay? So we do $3.20. There we go. Number 9. What is the cost per equivalent unit for conversion? So same thing. So the total conversion cost that we need to account for the entire period, not just what we started with, but what was added in, is 188,500. So we just want to convert that to a per equivalent unit basis. So what's the equivalent units for conversion? That's the 37,700, right? From this box right here. So we're just going to take that 188,500 and divide it by the equivalent units of production for conversion cost. That comes out to an even $5. Okay? Oops, let me erase that. All right. There we go. That is marked correct. All right, so let's go on to number 10. What is the cost of ending work in process inventory for materials? So this is where we require that second, or actually that third section of our template here, right? So this cost reconciliation portion. So before we move on, just keep in mind this total cost to account for, this box right here is important. So you always want to keep that one in mind, put a little star next to it. At the end of the day, that box will have to match up with this last box down here. It needs to be the same number. That's how we can check if our work's been done correctly. So now we're basically just wanting to know what cost to assign to those units that are left over in inventory, but just with respect to materials. Okay? But since it's asking us for the ending work in process cost, that's not until down here. So let's just do this entire bottom section. It also looks at the cost of the units we transferred on. So we'll finish this whole section, then we can go ahead and answer the rest of the questions. Okay? So let's first focus on the units we transferred to the next department. In this case, there isn't a second department, right? So it was just transferred to finished goods. So here we know how many units we transferred on, right? It was 34,500 units. But now we want to assign a dollar amount to that. We want to know what's the dollar amount that is attached to those units we transferred on. Because if you look at this T account, we want to know what to credit the work in process account for, right? What the cost of goods manufactured is. So if we don't know what the direct materials cost is and what the conversion cost is that is attached to those units we finished, we won't know what to credit that account for, okay? And what to debit finished goods for. So, or the next department if that were applicable. So here, let's first look at the units we transferred on. So where we want to know what the direct materials cost is plus the conversion cost then of those units we transferred on. But let's start with direct materials. So how many units did we transfer on? 34,500. And like you've heard me say many times before, these pens make these 4s switch to 9s, so that is a 4. Okay, so we transferred on 34,500 units. Now what's the equivalent, the cost per equivalent unit with respect to materials? We just found that, right? That's $3.20. So now, what's the total materials cost associated with those units we transferred on? We'll take the 34,500 times the 320. That gives us 110,400. Now that's just for materials, so we need to figure out the conversion cost to assign to those units. So how many units did we transfer on? 34,500. But what's the cost per equivalent unit with respect to conversion cost? That's $5. That's how much direct labor and applied overhead is associated with those 34,500 units we finished. So we'll multiply that by 5. It gives us $172,500 of conversion cost. So how much total cost is associated then with these units we transferred on? Well, that would be the 110,400 plus the 172,500 to give us a total cost transferred of 282,900. Okay, so this is going to be your cost of goods manufactured, the amount that you credit work in process for and you debit finished goods for. Okay, in this case, if there was a second department that it still needed to go through, then we're still working on it. Then the goods aren't completely finished overall, but they're finished with respect to this department. So we would simply credit this work in process account and then debit the next work in process account for the next department. Okay? So now we know what the costs are that are transferred out of this work in process account. Now we're going to see what costs to attach those units left over. Now, once you get to this point, and these two boxes, remember up at the top we put in the units transferred on. Now we're going to put in the equivalent units left over. What's the equivalent units in ending work in process for materials? We found that, right? That's the 8,000. But what's the equivalent units in ending work in process for conversion? That's 3,200. Okay? So we know those 8,000 units left over in ending work in process. With respect to materials, they're 100% done, right? So that's why we see 8,000 plugged in here, right? So we can multiply that 8,000 by the 320. So the total materials cost attached to those units in ending inventory is $25,600. But with respect to direct labor and overhead, those 8,000 units were only 40% done, right? So that's why the equivalent version of that is only 32 equivalent units in ending work in process with respect to conversion. Okay, so those 3,200 equivalent units, how much conversion cost did they have attached to them? Well, $5 per equivalent unit, right? So I have to put the 5 in here, and that comes out to $16,000. So basically, so far we've spent $16,000 of conversion cost on the partially complete units in ending inventory. So there's 8,000 units in ending inventory that aren't done yet, right? But if we took the cost that we already spent on getting those units partially complete, we could have, with respect to conversion cost, completed 3,200 units all the way. Okay? All right, so there's $25,600 of materials cost in ending work in process, and then $16,000 of conversion cost. What's the total cost in ending work in process inventory? Well, we're going to take the $25,600 plus the $16,000 to see that there's a total cost of $41,600 in our ending work in process inventory. So if we take the cost transferred on plus the cost left over, when we add those two together, it should give us the total cost to account for. And the total cost accounted for now. Because we know what we needed to account for up above, right? But now we're going to see how many costs do we account for now at the end. So let's take the costs transferred on to the next department, that $282,900, and let's add the cost left over in ending work in process. And we get $324,500. These two match up with one another, and that's what we want, right? Because the cost in beginning inventory plus the cost we add should be equal to the cost we transfer on plus the costs that are left over. Okay? So let's see, what's this one asking us? What's the cost of ending work in process inventory just for materials? Well, that's this one here, right? The $25,600 we found. Now you can see, if you can know how to fill out this template, you can fill out the entire template and just see what the problem's asking you and just pull it off of the template. Okay? That's why it's really nice to know how to fill this out. Now, can we do this all by hand without using a template? Definitely, but the template saves you some time if you know how to use it. And there are some ways to check your work, right, as you go through it. Okay, number 11, what is the cost of ending work in process inventory for conversion? So the conversion cost in ending inventory, it's the $16,000, right? One right here. I'll score in a second. There we go. All right. And the next one, what is the cost of materials transferred to finished goods? Well, we did this one just above ending inventory, right? The cost of materials transferred to finished goods, that would be the $110,400, right? That's how much of materials cost is attached to those units that we transferred on. There we go. And then 13, what is the amount of conversion cost transfer to finished goods? That is the $172,500. That's how much direct labor cost and overhead cost is attached to those units that we transfer to finished goods. Or if it were a company with another processing department, what the conversion cost is transferred just to the next department instead. There we go. All right, now it asks us, prepare the journal entry to record the transfer of costs from work in process to finished goods. Now remember, in this situation, since the next account is finished goods, since we actually finished everything, that would be the cost of goods manufactured that we are transferring from work in process to finished goods. In this case, it's cost of goods manufactured. But if this were a company, again, that it has one more department or two more departments to go to, then that amount that we transfer from this work in process to the next isn't necessarily cost of goods manufactured just yet. It's just the amount of cost attached to the units that we're simply transferring on to be completed. Okay, so we already found the costs transferred from work in process to finished goods. Right here up above it was a big question mark. We didn't know yet what to credit that account for, but we found that. So if we look in this template, the cost transferred to the next department is this box right here. So in the job order costing chapter, we learned how to transfer costs from work in process to finished goods, right? We just debit finished goods. In this case, for $282,900, and we will credit work in process, okay, for $282,900. Now, let me just clarify. If we were transferring not to finished goods but to another processing department, we would simply then be debiting a work in process account for that next department, okay? There we go. So the entries themselves are basically identical, very similar to job order costing, okay? Now the question is, what is the total cost to be accounted for? Well, we did that in the middle, right? We found out what's the cost in beginning work in process plus the cost added, and we found out the total cost to account for is this $324,500, right? But then after we found out how to allocate the cost between the units we finished and the units left over, we found the total cost that we were able to account for was the same amount, the $324,500. If we do this correctly and we don't make any math mistakes, then these two numbers need to be the same. Because remember, at the end of the day, the cost of beginning work in process plus the costs you add in need to be equal to the cost that you transfer on plus the costs that are left over. Otherwise, we are losing costs. Then we're losing track of costs. It can't just disappear into thin air, right? All right, let's score that last one. And that is it for the Foundational 15 for Chapter 4. So this template is very useful. So I would really strongly suggest you get comfortable with using this template. The more you practice, the more sense it makes. And try and use a template for all of your homework problems. So just know that some problems might ask you a really simple question, so you'd only have to do some part of the template. But some questions will ask, if one question is asking you, for example, what's the cost in ending work in process, you're going to have to work all the way through, right? So it's important to get comfortable with this, especially for when it's time for an exam once again. All right, so good luck with Chapter 4.